Wuninakan nitampag kanatawamag askatas kwamsen. It's very nice to be back. I know it's been a while. Had a lot going on, but as every time I have the opportunity to bring good words of encouragement and share some knowledge with you all, it's always a blessing. So we thank Creator for it. My people's title for the Creator was the Katantuit, the Great Spirit from the Southwest, from which all spirits come and to which all spirits must return. That was the title they gave to Creator. So we thank Creator above, the Creator of all, just for the opportunity to be speaking. It is Neesu Wushuwnoag, Director General for the Federation of Aboriginal Nations of the Americas, and I hope that this message finds you well this evening. Wanted to touch base and just share some updates. Keep our ear to the quote-unquote Aboriginal community. And got actually asked a question by the good brother Tomahawk Tony regarding an inquiry someone had made about the upcoming census, and hearing other people talk about how do you get your sovereignty. So we just wanted to take some time because these things are coming up to give some clarity on a few different elements. So I'm going to title this video tonight, The American versus the American Indian. The American versus the American Indian. And if I do a halfway decent job of making sure to articulate the position correctly, you should have an understanding of what I mean by that by the time we get done with this video. So let's get started. The American versus the American Indian. And when I utilize those two terms, those verses, really what I'm talking about is citizenship versus nationality. Citizenship versus nationality. Now, what is citizenship? Well, Black's Law 2nd edition says in general, citizenship or a citizen is a member of a free city or jural society, civitas, possessing all the rights and privileges that can be enjoyed by any person under its constitution and government and subject to the corresponding duties. So, excuse me. The first thing we see is that with citizenship or a citizen, there are privileges and civil rights that also come along with corresponding duties. So a citizen, someone who has citizenship, has privileges and civil rights, rights underneath that jural society or that free city under their constitution, but they're also subject to corresponding duties. All right? So that's citizenship, and we compare citizenship with nationality. And that, under Black's Law 2nd edition, is that quality or character which arises from the fact of a person's belonging to a nation or state. Nationality determines the political status of the individual, especially with reference to allegiance, while domicile determines his civil status. Nationality arises either by birth or by naturalization. According to Savigny, nationality is also used as opposed to territoriality for the purpose of distinguishing the case of a nation having no national territory. So we see now when we're talking nationality, what we're talking in actuality is territory. And let's look at what Black's Law says about that. A part of a country separated from the rest and subject to a particular jurisdiction. In American law, a portion of the United States not within the limits of any state, which has not yet been admitted as a state of the Union, but is organized with a separate legislature and with executive and judicial officers appointed by the president. We don't necessarily need to pay attention to the second half. This is Black's Law, so they try to give comprehensive definitions, I think, based upon the contemporary understanding. But the first part of a country separated from the rest and subject to a particular jurisdiction. So we're talking about territories when we're talking about nationality. And we're also talking about heritage. Heritage. And what is heritage? Well, it's in the civil law, every species of immovable which can be the subject of property, such as lands, houses, orchards, woods, marshes, ponds, etc., in whatever mode they may have been acquired, either by descent or purchase. So we're talking territory and heritage. We're talking the territory, the actual physical space where it's located, and the heritage, the things that belong to the people that come from there. And blood heritage is one of those types of heritages. So, first of all, when we talk about the American versus the American Indian is a discussion of citizenship, American being U.S. citizenship or American Republic citizenship or whatever you want to call it, but in this U.S., coming from the U.S. perspective, versus nationality, which is dealing with territory and heritage separate and foreign to a territory under a separate jurisdiction than the U.S. or the American Republic, whatever you want to call it. So that's what we're discussing, first of all, citizenship versus nationality. And it's important you understand that so that you can understand as I go deeper into these conversations tonight. Now, let me be clear. American Indian is not a nationality. I think it's a race. And at this point, it's a classification of U.S. citizenship. But we'll get to that. We'll get to that. When we're talking American versus American Indian, we have to keep in mind that both are colonial misnomers. None of our people were calling themselves Americans or American Indians prior to when Europeans got here. My people are Nahiganset, and from particular places, Meshipag, Shomet, Coesit, the list goes on, Nudakonkanet, the list goes on, Uskapag, the list goes on. So all of this American and American Indian stuff is all just colonial misnomers just to describe a certain type of people or a certain grouping of people that they decided to classify. So it's not actually who you are. They're both colonial misnomers, and when we understand that they're colonial misnomers, then we understand that we shouldn't attach any emotional elements to them and just look at them for what they are and how they properly apply. So let's look at American, and what we're going to look at is the fact that having taken our discussion about citizenship versus nationality, an American is just a citizen of America. Now, a lot of people point to this Webster's 1828 definition, but I think they interpret it a little bit wrong. So it says, a native of America, originally applied to the aboriginals or copper-colored races, found here by the Europeans. And I've heard people focus on that section, but that's not the section that should be focused on. There's two sections that should be focused on. The first one is the section that comes after that, but now applied to the descendants of Europeans born in America. So it did mean that, but now when you use the term American, you mean descendants of Europeans born in America. So when you're calling yourself an American, you're calling yourself a descendant of a European born in America. But perhaps even more important than that is the first element, a native of America. So an American is considered a native of America. That's what an American is. And we all know what a native means, right? Black's Law, 2nd edition, a natural born subject or citizen. So when you call yourself an American, what you're doing is calling yourself a native of America, which means you're calling yourself a natural born subject or citizen of America. When you call yourself an American. This, of course, comes from a perspective of being very individual and very self-focused, right? And for the most part, these Americans were naturalized. All of them they created their country, but it wasn't their land. They formed their own thing. So it's all through some sort of naturalization, really. It's nothing to really do with birth, even though once they got going, you could get citizenship through birth. But keep that in mind. When you use this term American, what you're saying is that you're a native of America. That's the first element. The rest of it is describing that first one or giving history on it. But a native of America, and a native is a natural born subject or citizen of America, a denizen by birth, one who owes his domicile or citizenship to the fact of his birth within the country referred to. An American, when you use that term, you're stating that you are a natural born subject or citizen of America. Now let's go down to Indian, really. Indian. And we add the American on because America is what they called these lands. So the American becomes the descriptor, the type of Indian. If you notice, you have European American. The type of American is European. Italian American. The type of American is Italian. Portuguese American. The type of American is Portuguese. African American. The type of American is African. So it's all describing the type of American. When you look at this term Indian, you'll notice that American starts to describe the Indian. So the Indian is the term that's in the superior position in this term American Indian, as opposed to Native American, European American, African American. All of those are describing the American, which is the natural born subject or citizen of America. The American Indian, well, what is an Indian? It's an aboriginal inhabitant of the Americas. And that's from Black's Law 2nd edition. So the Indian and the American Indian is describing what type, where the Indian is at, where it's located at. The Indian is an aboriginal inhabitant of the Americas. The American is a natural born subject or citizen of America. So that's the fundamental basis of our conversation tonight, the American versus the American Indian. Because as we get into this, the real concern is that seems to be a growing sort of thought pattern that you can conduct yourself in an American fashion, but still claim to be an American Indian. And we're going to get into why that doesn't make sense, and why it can actually get you in a lot of trouble. So let's first start, once again, understanding American versus American Indian. Let's look at what the classifications for American Indian tribes are. And there's going to be 5 of them thus far that we're aware of. So the first is commercially non-viable. That means you know who you are, people are together, but they don't exist anywhere in commerce. So you're going to be subject. You're going to be subject. You're subjects of the U.S. Next, you have Indian tribes that have gone and formed 501c3s and for-profit corps and all that, and incorporated the tribe as a domestic entity. They're subject. So they're going to have to go by whatever the rules and regulations are for state and local, based upon where they incorporated that. Next, you're going to go to your state recognized. And this is a relationship that perhaps was established with the colonial powers or the states as they were growing into the federal government before the rules were set in place. But this is going to be a domestic dependent / quasi-sovereign relationship. So state recognized tribes are in that relationship for the most part, and that's why they can get funding and things of that nature from the federal government, because they're recognized, they exist commercially in some form that's not just solely dependent to the U.S. or to the state, but still domestic dependent, still quasi-sovereign. Then you have your federally recognized tribes, which are domestic dependents and quasi-sovereign, and they dealt directly with the federal government. So those are you a little bit more contemporary relationships that were developed. And then after that, you start, that's where the BIA and all that came from, because they didn't want to deal with Indians on a treaty basis anymore. And then you have your 5th one, and this is the space that the FANA tribes have been moving in. This is your pre-colonial tribes, and these are considered sovereign and foreign to the U.S. So these are just some of the elements that go into establishment of a pre-colonial tribal entity. But first, it's historically acknowledged. So it's one of those tribes that is acknowledged in the history books as being here when Europeans arrived. When whatever was going on, these are tribes that were around. And that's important. That's what really does away with starting new tribes, because if you start new tribes, then there's no historical acknowledgement, then you have no pre-colonial status, and you're going to fall into one of those previous 4 categories, and most likely domestic entity, which means you're under state and federal jurisdiction. The state, that has to be a relationship you develop directly with the governor or whoever the appointee is, and the federally recognized, that's directly with the BIA or whatever. So if you're not one of those, then you're either domestic entity or you're commercially non-viable. Those are the only other elements. And even if you are some sort of foreign entity, you figure out that route, you're still subject to the state and the federal jurisdiction when you're doing business. You're just going by whatever the state and federal rules are. So starting new tribes that's not necessarily the route to go. That's really not the route to go. Especially if you think that you're going to be able to move in a pre-colonial status. Remember, this is sovereignty and being in a foreign status, but also sovereignty. So historically acknowledged. Next, you have to have the possessory interest in the land. That means the rights to the land. Did your tribe actually have the rights to the land? There were tribes that are around, but in many instances, they might have been subject to another tribe. So did they have the possessory rights to be giving away lands? Or there were tribes that, used to fight over lands, but they weren't controlled by that tribe at the time of European contact. And that tribe went because they didn't like the other tribe and gave that land away to Europeans. That's not necessarily lawful. They didn't have the possessory interest in those lands. So you have to have the possessory interest to make any sort of land claims. And a lot of times that comes down to that. Well, that does. Not a lot of times. That comes down to bloodlines and connections to people that were signing treaties at that time. And then it's also going to be on a first come, first serve basis, right? Because if someone else has the claim, same bloodlines, and has made the claim before you, then you can't come in and be like, oh, well, I've got that claim too. You have to deal with them first if that claim has already been taken. So you have historically acknowledged and then possessory interest, unextinguished land claims, because a lot of people moved. When you went out, when the tribes got moved, I know a lot of our family moved out to Brothertown. They gave up their possessory interest in these lands and took lands out in Brothertown. Now, does that mean that they're not family? Absolutely not. But it also doesn't mean that they could come here and kind of direct things, just like we can't go out to Brothertown and direct things because they're Narragansetts. So unextinguished land claims. And a lot of that times that ties into the next element, which is a continuing presence in the territory. Because most of the tribes that still have unextinguished land claims are going to be the tribes that are still in their territories. Mashapag was still in our territories. Pretty much all of the New England tribes, New England area tribes, are still in their territories. Pretty much all of the northeastern tribes are still in their territories. Pretty much all of the eastern seaboard tribes are still in their territories. Most of us just got misclassified as something other than an Indian. So continuing presence. So I got historically acknowledged possessory interests, unextinguished land claims, continuing presence in the territory, and then this is a key one as well, right? Because this really solidifies because we're playing in a European law system, treaty acknowledged. And this is what you need to be sure about and understand when it comes to treaties. Treaties are contracts between nations. Nations are considered sovereign. So what does that mean? Well, that means that the nation really has to be the one enforcing it. And individuals generally do not have rights under treaties as a matter of international law and may enforce treaties on their own behalf only when they have rights under treaties as a matter of international law. And you can look at U.S. v. Verdugo Urquidez and U.S. v. Alvarez Machain if you want to see some more around those rulings and kind of what those two principles are. But you have to understand that individuals generally cannot enforce treaty rights under international law. So unless there's language specifically in that treaty that's understood under international law that says individuals can do that. And when you look back at these Indian treaties that were going on even in pre-colonial times, there was no talk about individuals enforcing them. It was about the tribe and the chief and the Indians collectively. So in most matters, it really should be your tribe or your nation that's advocating on your behalf. And that's getting into another subject matter, but just understand that individuals generally do not have rights under treaties as a matter of international law and may enforce treaties on their own behalf only when they have rights under treaties as a matter of international law. So if you're dealing with one of those pre-colonial Indian treaties, most likely you don't have individual rights to enforce it. Your tribe has to enforce it on your behalf. And then the other element to keep in mind under treaties is that citizens cannot enforce treaties against their own nation, and that'll become clear later on when we get to the Snyder Act and why Indians got citizenship conferred upon them. So individuals generally do not have rights under treaties as a matter of international law and generally may enforce treaties only on their behalf only when they have rights under treaties as a matter of international law, and citizens cannot enforce treaties against their own. So we got historically acknowledged possessory interests, unextinguished land claims, continuing presence in territory, treaty acknowledged. Lastly, commercially viable. And see, this is where a lot of the misinformation around trust could really get people in trouble, because you really have to meet all of those elements first before you start looking at creating any sort of trust-making land claims. Before you have to meet pretty much all of those elements in terms of pre-colonialism before you can get into making any sort of commercial viability through tribal trusts that are foreign and private. If you're missing any of those elements, by law, you're not going to be considered to be pre-colonial, or someone else is going to be able to challenge that claim. And if that's the case, you don't want to be caught out there with a claim that's not 100%. So, very good. I thought it closed out for a second. So those elements: historically acknowledged, possessory interests, unextinguished land claims, continuing presence in territory, treaty acknowledged in many instances, and commercially viable. Those are some of the base elements that comprise a pre-colonial tribe. So just quickly, those American Indian tribe classifications were commercially non-viable, domestic entity, state recognized, federally recognized, or pre-colonial. Now that you understand what those are, let's look at what the classifications of American Indian are. So first you have your misclassified American Indians, where a lot of us were African Americans. colored folks, Negroes, white in some instances, Latino, Hispanic, Asian, I don't know, whatever they misclassified people to so that they would not be able to enforce anything. We put them under misclassified, and their status in the U.S. is going to be a U.S. citizen. Now let's look at the next classification. We'll call these reservation Indians, and this is usually federally recognized or state recognized Indians because they usually have a reservation. Some sort of reserve is set up for them. Their status is going to be U.S. citizen. Then we're going to have our urban Indians. These are Indian folk because most Indians don't live on the reservations anymore. They're going to be in our city areas. They're urban Indians, and their status is U.S. citizen. And then we've got our rural Indians, right? The ones that are out living in the countryside, because not all Indians want to live in the city and be with the bright lights and all that. So they're going to be rural Indians, and they're going to be U.S. citizens. So if you're misclassified, if you're a reservation Indian, if you're an urban Indian, or if you're a rural Indian, you're a U.S. citizen. Plain and simple, you are subject to state and local laws. And once again, we'll get to that in a moment. Just hold on to that, though, and understand that, because I want to get into a decent conversation about this status of Indian not taxed. So that you understand, if you're misclassified, if you're a reservation Indian, if you're an urban Indian, or if you're a rural Indian, no matter what type of Indian you are a U.S. citizen, unless you're an Indian not taxed. And what an Indian not taxed is a foreign national aboriginal inhabitant. Now, the only way to hold this status as of now, we're not talking about when the censuses were being done. We're not talking about going all the way back to when first contact was going on. Those are your ancestors. Those are the ancestors. For individuals living and breathing today, the only way to get to this Indian not tax status and to be considered a foreign national aboriginal inhabitant is to be a tribal citizen of a pre-colonial American Indian tribe. And you saw what all of those elements are that go under pre-colonial American Indian tribes: historically acknowledged, possessory interest, unextinguished land claims, continuing presence in the territory, treaty acknowledged, and commercially viable. You have to be a tribal citizen of one of those types of tribes to be an Indian not taxed. And let's see why. This term Indian not taxed is first mentioned in the 1830 U.S. Census. All right. In the 1860 U.S. instructions, they say Indians not taxed are not to be enumerated. So Indians not taxed are not to be enumerated. Now let's look at who is to be enumerated. The families of Indians who have renounced tribal rule and who under state or territorial laws exercise the rights of citizens are to be enumerated. So hear me. If you are not a tribal citizen under tribal rule of a pre-colonial tribe, you are to be enumerated. That's what they were saying in 1860. You are to be enumerated. You are taxable. You are not an Indian not taxed. All right? 1870, U.S. Census instructions change a little bit. It says Indians not taxed are not to be enumerated on Schedule 1. Indians out of their tribal relations and exercising the rights of citizens under state or territorial laws will be included. So once again, if you're out of your tribal relations, which means you're not a member of a tribe, a pre-colonial, you're not a member of a federally recognized, state recognized, any type of tribe, you're just an Indian, all right? You're just an Indian. That's all you're moving in. You're not trying to get into the other specific stuff that comes along with being an Indian. If you don't want to get into that, then you are to be enumerated. You are an American, a natural born subject or citizen of America, a Native American. That's what you are. If you're not in a tribal relationship with a tribe, if you're just going to be not there, then you're considered an American by law. Let's go on to the 1880 definition of an Indian not taxed. This is the U.S. Census once again. It says, by the phrase Indians not taxed is meant Indians living on reservations. So they're getting specific now. Indians living on reservations under the care of government agents or roaming individually or in bands over unsettled tracts of country. So Indian not taxed means they're living on reservations at this point. They're roaming individually or in bands over unsettled tracts of country. Unsettled tracts of country. That's the important element right there. And here it goes again further. This is 1880. Indians not in tribal relations whether full-bloods or half-breeds, who are found mingled with the white population, residing in white families, engaged as servants or laborers, or living in huts or wigwams on the outskirts of towns or settlements, are to be regarded as part of the ordinary population of the country for the constitutional purpose of the apportionment of the country of the apportionment of representatives among the states, and are to be embraced in the enumeration. So once again, if you are not in tribal relations, if you do not have, not a member of a tribe, you're enumerated, you're an American. It's that simple. There's no Indians not taxed. That's by the law and definition as they were enumerating it. In order to be Indian not taxed, you have to be associated with the tribe. That's the point that I'm trying to hammer home here, which is why we said from the very beginning with FANA, once you get your genealogy, go and get with your tribe. Go and get with your tribe. You cannot do this on your own. The system's not set up for you to do it on your own. When you try to do it on your own, you're moving into sovereign citizen territory. And that's not a space that you want to be in if you're claiming to be an Indian. So let's go on to the 1890 U.S. Census definition. By the phrase Indians not taxed is meant Indians living on reservations under the care of government agents or roaming individually or in bands over unsettled tracts of country. Unsettled tracts. Now you tell me where here in the U.S. are you going to be unsettled tracts if you're an urban Indian? Where is an urban Indian finding unsettled tracts at? Let's go on to 1900. In the 1900 U.S. Census, there was a separate population schedule was used for Indian families, both those on reservations and those living in family groups outside of reservations. So once again, that reservation is considered a split in jurisdiction between state territories and all that, but all of this is under federal. And then it says an Indian is to be considered taxed if he or she is detached from his or her tribe. So this is in 1900. If you are detached from your tribe, you are to be enumerated. You are taxed. There is no Indian not tax status if you are detached from your tribe. And living among white people as an individual, and as such subject to taxation, whether he or she actually pays taxes or not. Also, if he or she is living with his or her tribe but has received an allotment of land and thereby has acquired citizenship. Now, this will explain to you why a lot of your ancestors were getting allotments. Why they got allotments of land. So once again, when you go to those door rolls or any of those rolls and it shows that your people got an allotment, yeah, they're Indians, but they're citizens when they receive that allotment. That allotment takes them out of the Indians not tax status. They're now U.S. citizens by law. An Indian on a reservation without an allotment or roving over unsettled territory is considered not taxed. So if your ancestors got an allotment, they accepted U.S. citizenship, you had a birth certificate after, so you're a U.S. citizen. You're only a Indian not taxed. It all starts if you have relations with your tribe. If you do not have relations with your tribe, there's no conversations around Indians not taxed, and then it depends on what your status of relationship is between your tribe and this U.S. government. And then 1920, there was no separate Indian schedule. So they stuck with what happened in 1900, and then 1920, they just got rid of the Indians not taxed thing. And we're going to get to why that is in a moment. But I want to clarify once again, Indian not taxed is only for tribal citizens in this day and age of a pre-colonial American Indian tribe. And that's because they have to be inhabiting unsettled territory. And what is unsettled territory in this day and age? It's a separate commercial jurisdiction. Because everything's settled. So the only way it could be unsettled, which means not improved upon or developed by them, is if it's in a separate foreign commercial jurisdiction. And the only way to do that we are aware of from a tribal perspective is to go the pre-colonial route. All of those elements that I touched upon, let me just read them again so that everyone is aware and knowledgeable. Once again, historically acknowledged, having possessory interest, unextinguished land claims, continuing presence in the territory, treaty acknowledged and commercially viable. And the possessory interest, let me touch base on this. This a lot of times comes down to direct blood lineage to the people that were signing treaties back then. When we look at the Pokanoket, the Sagamore, and the chief of the Pokanoket tribe, Dancing Star, they come directly from the Massasoit. directly from the Massasoit, so they have the possessory interest to be able to say, well, wait a minute, my grandfather, my great-grandfather never gave that land to you. You took it. You have to give it back to me. I represent the nation. You'd have to give it back to me. Someone else who was not from that direct line can't make that same claim. For my people, my particular clan, we come directly down from the Michaels and the Champlains, who come from the Canonicus and Miantinomi. So that's two different chiefs that were acknowledged in the 1600s. So people in my clan and double descendants from Chief Bristol Michael in the late 1800s. So the right that we have, the possessory interest to go and say, hey, look, these were our people's lands, and I have the right to claim them, that's a powerful position. Every Indian is not going to be in a position to do that, so that's why we say at FANA, go get with your tribe, and you should be backing up your chief. Who is it that you know that has the right to do that? Because they're around. They're around. So let's look at, once again, only for tribal citizens of a pre-colonial American Indian tribe. That's because they're inhabiting unsettled territory, separate commercial jurisdiction. They have not acquired U.S. citizenship. You cannot tell me that in your name you're not a U.S. citizen somewhere. And if you only exist in the U.S. jurisdiction, then you cannot argue that you have not acquired U.S. citizenship. You can, if you want to expatriate, get rid of your citizenship, that's fine, but that doesn't mean you never had it. So if you had it at one point and you choose to give it up, the question then becomes, if you've given it up, what nation are you a part of? And for most of us, we're not a part of any tribal nation. We just have our lineage, and lineage is not nationality. Lineage is just who you belong to, who you're related to. It's not nationality. You only exist commercially as a U.S. citizen. So you have acquired U.S. citizenship. You're not going to be an Indian not taxed. Those who have not renounced tribal rule. If you are not associated with the tribe, then you have renounced tribal rule. You're not an Indian not taxed. Once again, all respect to who your lineage is, but if you are not in tribal relations, then you're not an Indian not taxed, because that status comes from the relationship with your tribe. It's not an individual thing. It's from your tribe. And lastly, they do not exercise the rights of U.S. citizens. Now, this is all from the U.S. Census. You can pull this out of reading what the different definitions are. But they do not exercise the rights of U.S. citizens. And what's that mean, a birth certificate? If you got a state birth certificate, if you were born and got a birth certificate, you're a U.S. citizen. You're born in the U.S. That's exactly what they meant when we get to this next element we're going to discuss in just a moment. But if you have a birth certificate, you're born in the U.S., you're a citizen. If you got a social security number, you're most likely a citizen. If you got a driver's license, all of these things that everyone's talking about, if you got them already, you're a citizen. You're in the system. That's what it is. So you're not going to be an Indian not taxed. That is a separate jurisdiction. You're going to be a U.S. citizen, albeit you'll be able to have addressed the misclassification and be in the system properly, to be serviced by the system and engage with the system correctly as an American Indian, if that's what your blood heritage is. Now, let me be very clear. American Indian is a blood heritage. I don't really care much about the DNA stuff and all that. I think it's good for connecting you with people that you're related to, but I've also seen it connect people that necessarily aren't connected through Indian blood, connected through another ancestor who an Indian married. And so, they're finding connections on that side, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's Indian blood there. So, to me, the Indian blood is all about a birthright, being born this, passed down from your ancestors. So, all of those things, though, will make you a U.S. citizen, point blank. All of those things, if you inhabit settled territory, urban Indians, you're not in a separate commercial jurisdiction. If you've acquired U.S. citizenship, if you're named somewhere in a U.S. citizen, you voted, any of that. If you renounce tribal rule, you're not even associated with the tribe. And if you exercise the rights of U.S. citizens, which we all do on a daily basis, you're a citizen. That's what the situation is. That's just what the matter is. 99.9% of us right now are in citizenship status, I would argue. So now we have that. Don't want to leave y'all on a damper. Just want to make sure y'all understand, so you understand how to maneuver correctly in this system. And we've done videos on all of these things before, Indian tax status and all that. This last element that I want to look at before we conclude this evening is 8 U.S.C. 1401B. This is the codification of the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. and this is titled Nationals and Citizens of United States at Birth. 1401B states, and this is interesting because if you notice, people like to use, well, I'm not a Native American, I'm an American Indian. When I'm not an Indian, I'm an Aborigine. All of these terms, which are still just colonial misnomers. Let's look at what 8 USC 1401B says. A person born in the United States to a member of an Indian, Eskimo, Aleutian, or other Aboriginal tribe. So you can be American Aborigine, you can be Aboriginal autochthonous, whatever you would like to be, you are considered a U.S. citizen if you are born in the United States. If you have a birth certificate, you were born in the U.S., you are a United States citizen. Now, this is the key element here. This is the key element, and this is what people really need to understand. This does away with a lot of the concerns you hear from sort of wayward Moors who don't know anything about Indian law and aren't willing to learn. Don't know anything about Indian law and not willing to learn. Let's look at this particular provision right here. Provided that the granting of citizenship under this subsection shall not in any manner impair or otherwise affect the right of such person to tribal or other property. So that right there is letting you know that there is a separation of jurisdiction between a U.S. citizenship and a tribal jurisdiction, because U.S. citizenship cannot in any manner impair or otherwise affect the right of an Indian, a person born in the United States to a member of Indian, Eskimo, Aleutian, or other Aboriginal tribe. It can't affect their right to tribal or other property. Tribal property is separate from U.S. jurisdiction. But hear that. Tribal property, not your individual property. Tribal property. And that's where maneuvering through the trust and all that comes in. But once again, you can't do that unless you're in the pre-colonial status. So when we talk about 8 USC 1401B, what it's basically telling you is that if you were born in the U.S., state birth certificate, you've got U.S. citizenship, so long as that citizenship doesn't interfere with your access to tribal property. If you're not relations with a tribe, you have no tribal property, in which case you are a U.S. citizen. That's simple. If it's not, your tribe is the barrier between you and the U.S. It's not your lineage, it's your relationship with your tribe and your tribe's existence, what they call standing, and relationship with the U.S. And what is it? Once again, we gave you what? You got the commercially non-viable, so they don't have any. You're just a regular U.S. citizen. You have your domestic entities, and they're going to be subjects, so they have to follow state and local laws, even if they're foreign. If they're foreign, you're going by state and local law. You have to go by state recognized and federally recognized. So you have 4 statuses of Indian tribes, and then the 5th one is the pre-colonial, and those 4 are all going to be under federal law, some form or fashion. So you're going to have to understand what those laws are, but you're most certainly not going to be in an Indian not taxed position because of the elements that come along with being an Indian not taxed. That means you have to be inhabiting unsettled territory. That's where the tribal citizenship of a pre-colonial tribe comes in, because now you are a citizen of a separate foreign jurisdiction. You have to have not acquired U.S. citizenship. When your person is born or is created in that other space, when you repatriate and you're reestablished under the tribal jurisdiction, that's where the Neesu's at. There is no U.S. citizenship on Neesu. Neesu's never had any U.S. citizenship. The commercial U.S. citizen under the U.S. that was born there, that has that, but Neesu is in a separate foreign commercial jurisdiction. This is why there's no requirement of citizenship. It's two persons. Indians have dual citizenship. So I'm operating in both of my citizenships, but simultaneously, because they're in my actual land. This other status was placed on top of me while I was here. So I still exist here, but I'm also in here because they created a space by conferring jurisdiction and conferring citizenship. So have not renounced tribal rule. So if you're not associated with, if you don't have a chief, if you're not subject to a council, if you're not on anyone's rolls, if you're not associated with anyone, then you renounce tribal rule, and you're not an Indian not taxed. You're enumerated by the census rules. And if you exercise the rights of a U.S. citizen, you are a U.S. citizen. Birth certificate, voting, social security number, driver's license, any of that, gotten health care benefits, welfare, whatever the case may be, in your name as a citizen, stuff that's available to citizens, you're a citizen. So then we went on to 8 USC 1401B. So if you're born in the U.S., with a birth certificate, you're a U.S. citizen. The only way to be the Indian not taxed, a separate jurisdiction, is through the pre-colonial American Indian tribe, and we laid out those. But it's important to remember by that language, Indians have dual citizenship, tribal citizenship and U.S. citizenship. But it's all about the status that your tribal relations are. If you are a member of a tribe that is commercially non-viable, then you're just a U.S. citizen. That's the only space that you exist in. If you are a member of a tribe that is a domestic entity, then you're just a U.S. citizen because they're subjects. If you're a member of a federally or state recognized tribe, then that's going to be subject to whatever relationship your tribe has with the state or feds, and you're going to be domestic dependent but quasi-sovereign. That's a better status than maybe U.S., maybe not, depends. And then, of course, you can get into your pre-colonial with your foreign national, aboriginal inhabitants, whatever the case may be. Indians have dual citizenship, but it all depends upon A, what your tribal relationship is, because lineage is different from tribe, and B, if that tribe is what their relationship is with the U.S. So what your relationship is with your tribe, and then what your tribe's relationship is with the U.S. That's how you determine the Indian not tax status. And remember, all Indians are U.S. citizens if they're born in the U.S. If you have a state birth certificate, you are a U.S. citizen. So let's hit the conclusion, and then I'm going to touch on one more base after the conclusion. So the conclusion, heritage is separate from, citizenship is separate from nationality. When you're talking citizenship, you're talking about rights and privileges that are civil. When you're talking nationality, you're talking territory and heritage. And the heritage, of course, includes your blood heritage. And the blood heritage is really what determines all of these other things that come on, particularly your possessory interest when you're discussing Indian not tax status and land claims. Citizenship is separate from nationality. As such, American is separate from American Indian because an American is a native of America, a natural born citizen or subject of America, a Native American, which is opposed to an American Indian. As we discussed, an Indian is an aboriginal inhabitant of the Americas, and the American was them trying to confer some sort of jurisdiction, but the American is describing the Indian is not describing the American. The Indian is in the more primary position in that particular descriptor than American is. And when you look at the other ones, European American, Italian American, Portuguese American, African American, Latino American, all of those other ones are in an inferior descriptive position to the American. So that should tell you something right there. Indians living among white people as individuals who have relinquished tribal relations are enumerated and taxable. So if you're not associated with any tribe, if you don't have any tribal relations, you don't want to be on a roll, you don't care about any of that nonsense, that's cool, but you will be a U.S. citizen. You will be an American. You're not going to be an Indian not taxed. You'll be an Indian. You'll be an individual who has lineage to Indians. But remember, as of 8 USC 1401B, if you got a birth certificate, you are considered a citizen. So you are a citizen, and an Indian not tax status is only going to apply to a tribal citizen of a pre-colonial American Indian tribe, as far as we know. But take a look at that information. I put some links down in the bottom so you can look it up for yourself. Just, think about what we're saying tonight, especially when you start to talk about taxation and things of that nature, because they will come and get you quick. You need to really make sure you know what you're talking about, and you have to understand that treaty rights, all of that, that's not for individuals, that's for nations. Your nation should be the one enforcing that. And if you are not a pre-colonial nation, or if you are not a nation that actually has rights to treaties, you can't enforce them. You can't just say, well, I'm Creek, so that treaty, how does that apply to you? Were you those particular Creeks? Were you who's who? It's all about your bloodline. What is your particular narrative? Who do you connect to? Which is why you need to do your genealogy. And after you do your genealogy, you need to go and find who the tribe is or where the tribe is. There's this notion that when people wake up, because they're not aware of it, it must not exist. And that's absolutely absurd. There are tribes around with individuals that look just like you and me that have been around for very long times. Very, very long times, and who acknowledge and respect their own. I had a woman reach out just the other day, same bloodlines as mine. Lo and behold, soon as she said a few names, we connected. Whole tribe embraced her, because that's how it is when you're legit. When you come with this, oh, the Aboriginal folks, you got to speak something specific to the tribe, specific. And you should not be coming back to the tribe with your hand out wanting to know what the tribe can do for you. That is an American attitude, individual focused. The tribe, you think communally. What can you do for the tribe? What are you bringing to help the tribe out when you reach out to the tribe? How are you trying to be of assistance, and not assistance in terms of what you're trying to do for the tribe, but of what the tribe needs? So perhaps the first conversation, before you even ask about, hey, is there anything I can do to help the tribe out? That goes so far. Do you know that? That goes so far. That goes so far. It really, when you're dealing with someone who comes humbly and respectfully and wanting to know what they can contribute, rather than arrogantly and demandingly wanting to know what you can give them, it really gets a different response from a tribe who you choose to engage with. It really does. So citizenship is separate from nationality. American is separate from American Indians. American Indians are U.S. citizens by the Snyder Act, 8 U.S.C. 1401b. Indians living among the whites as individuals who have relinquished tribal relations are enumerated and taxable. An Indian not tax only applies to tribal citizens of pre-colonial American Indian tribes. That's kind of the gist. It was a pretty long one tonight, but I wanted to get that information out there so that we can clear up any sort of misconceptions, so that no one makes any sort of false claims or anything like that, especially as the census is coming up. You don't want to be putting on the census you're an Indian not taxed, and you not being Indian not taxed, because now they have a record of you saying that you're an Indian not taxed. Now they know to watch you to see if you're actually trying to do that when they know that you're not. Touching on the census, once again, the census, anything coming from the U.S., first of all, there's no individual sovereignty. Nothing, no document out here can give you individual sovereignty. Sovereignty comes through your relationship with your tribe and this relationship with the U.S. So if you're looking for sovereignty from the U.S., you need to be a part of a sovereign nation. You yourself will not be sovereign. It doesn't work that way. So when we're talking about the census, and this really runs contrary to what a lot of the Moors' perspective is, when we're talking about the census is not necessarily a bad thing for Indians. The census can allow you to reclassify yourself if you have been misclassified as something other than an Indian. If you were a Negro, colored, whatever, the census is one means to do that, but the census is not going to get you out of paying taxes. It's not going to get you out of being pulled over. It's not going to get you out of even driver's license. You have to be a member of a separate nation that has the standing to do those sorts of things. And that's why all of these people popping up making new tribes, you're all putting yourself right on a black identity extremist watch list by the feds for making false claims, because they know who's who. So this one means of correcting any misclassification that has taken place, but even that, you still have to have a tribal affiliation. So when they ask who you are, you can put American Indian and you can put I'm Choctaw, but there's no tribal affiliation there, so they're going to assume that you're not associated, you're just talking lineage, and you're going to be a U.S. citizen. You're going to be a U.S. citizen. However, once again, if you have not corrected your status anywhere else, and even if you have, it's one other way, because that also determines how many funds go to your area to service your population of American Indians. Because remember, it's a different status and standing than Negro, than colored, than Latino, than white. American Indian is different than those. So definitely, it is one means to look at of reclassification. But be clear, it does not confer any Indian not tax status. It cannot confer any separate jurisdiction. It is a U.S. document. It is for their purposes. And as you can see, when you look through the history of the census, they were trying to figure out a way to enumerate Indians correctly. And if you did not retain relations, if you were civilized, if you were assimilated, if you were born in the U.S., i.e. birth certificate, you are a U.S. citizen, plain and simple. Hope that is informative to you all, family. Hope that this information is beneficial to you on your continued journey. And just don't have itching ears. Think about stuff that's sold to you. This has been going on for 400 years. It's not going to be that easy. Anyone who comes and tells you it's that simple, question it. Everything that we've done or tried to tell you from the beginning, we've always tried to give it in the context that this isn't an overnight thing. It's not a snap of the fingers thing. Tribes up in this area have been fighting since the 1600s and are just getting the type of foothold that we need to move forward. Do you think that it would be, I know people don't like to talk about creator or God, do you think that it would be cosmically just for you to hop up after tribes have been fighting for 400 years and figure it out in 6 months and become an expert? Probably not. So we give all praise to Creator as always for His goodness and grace and mercy to us. We are so blessed to be able to share this with you this evening. And unto you, Wushuwnoag, Nitampag, family and friends, I say, Wushuwnoag, have a great evening. Aquani, peace be unto you. And peace Kanash. Creator willing, we will see each other soon. Aho.